The knife was already at her wrist when the kitchen door swung open. Mira froze, her fingers still curled around the small blade she carried for protection, not for eating, though tonight she had planned to use it to scrape the last bit of mold off a piece of bread she found in the trash bin behind the bakery. The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread poured out of the open door like a wave, and her stomach twisted so hard she nearly dropped the knife. A tall woman with flour on her apron stood in the doorway, staring at her with narrowed eyes. This was the back entrance to Ashcombe Manor, the largest estate in the county, and Mira had walked 3 miles in worn shoes just to stand outside its kitchen and breathe in the smell of food she could not afford.
"You again,"
the woman said. Her name was Agnes, and she had run this kitchen for 11 years. She had seen beggars before, plenty of them, but something about this girl was different. Her clothes were torn but not filthy. Her hands, though thin, were clean. She carried herself the way someone carries themselves when they were taught manners, before hunger taught them shame. "Please," Mira said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just scraps. Anything you would throw away." Agnes glanced behind her, into the warm kitchen, then back at the girl shivering on the stone step. 6 months ago, Mira would never have imagined herself here. 6 months ago, she had a home, a family name that meant something, and a future that did not involve begging at the back door of a stranger's mansion. But her father's debts had swallowed everything, and when he died suddenly of a fever, the creditors did not wait a single week before taking the house, the furniture, even the silverware that had been in the family for 3 generations. "Come in then," Agnes said, stepping aside, "but only for a moment. If the steward sees you, we will both be in trouble." Mira stepped into the kitchen, and the heat hit her like a gentle slap. She had almost forgotten what warmth felt like. The room was large, with copper pots hanging from the ceiling, and a fire roaring in a stone hearth big enough to stand inside. Bread cooled on a wooden table. A pot of stew bubbled softly, filling the air with the smell of onions and beef. And in the corner, near the fire, sat a man. He was dressed in rags, his hair long and unwashed, his face covered in dirt, and a beard that had clearly not seen a razor in weeks. He sat on a low stool, eating from a wooden bowl with his hands, and he did not look up when Mira entered. She assumed he was another beggar, perhaps one Agnes had taken pity on before her, or maybe a stable hand who had fallen on hard times of his own. Agnes moved to a cupboard and pulled out a small parcel wrapped in cloth. Inside was a heel of bread, a piece of cold chicken, and a wedge of cheese that had gone slightly hard at the edges. "This is all I can spare tonight," Agnes said, pressing it into Mira's hands. "Eat by the fire for 5 minutes, then you must go." Mira sat on the bench near the hearth, as far from the ragged man as she could manage, and began to eat. She tried to eat slowly, to make it last, but her body betrayed her, and she tore into the bread like an animal. Tears stung her eyes, not from sadness exactly, but from the strange mixture of relief and shame that came with charity. The man in the corner glanced at her once, then twice. He said nothing at first. He simply watched the way she ate, the way her hands trembled slightly, the way she kept glancing toward the door, as though expecting to be thrown out at any moment. "You eat like someone who remembers better meals," he said finally. His voice was low and rough, but there was something underneath the roughness, something careful and precise, like a voice that had been trained to speak a certain way before it had chosen, for some reason, to sound rougher than it was. Mira looked up, startled. She had not expected the beggar to speak, let alone to speak with such an odd observation. "Everyone remembers better meals," she said carefully, not wanting to reveal too much of herself to a stranger in a stranger's kitchen. "True enough," the man said, and went back to his bowl. Agnes busied herself at the stove, stirring the stew, occasionally glancing at the two of them with a curious expression. She had never seen the ragged man speak to anyone before. He had been coming to her kitchen for almost 2 months now, always at night, always quiet, always alone. She had assumed he was simply another unfortunate soul the estate had taken pity on, someone the head groundskeeper allowed to sleep in the stables in exchange for small chores. She never asked questions. In her experience, people who ended up hungry at a stranger's door rarely wanted to explain how they got there. Mira finished the bread and wrapped the remaining chicken and cheese in the cloth to save for later. She stood, brushing crumbs from her lap, and turned to thank Agnes. "Thank you," she said. "I will not forget this kindness." "Do not thank me too much," Agnes said, though her voice was gentler than her words. Come back tomorrow if you must. I will see what I can spare. Mira nodded and turned toward the door. As she passed the ragged man, he lifted his bowl slightly, as if in a small salute, though he still did not look directly at her. She paused for half a second, unsure why, then continued out into the cold night. The walk back to the small shed where she had been sleeping, an abandoned structure near the edge of town that once housed farming tools, took nearly an hour. The night was cold, and the wind cut through her thin coat like a blade. She wrapped her arms around herself and thought about the strange man in the kitchen, the way he had spoken, the way his eyes, when he finally glanced at her, seemed far too sharp and far too aware for someone who lived on scraps. She told herself it did not matter. Tomorrow she would need food again, and the kitchen at Ashcombe Manor was the only kindness she had found in weeks. She would return, she decided, and she would try not to think too much about the man by the fire. But as she lay down that night on a bed of old straw, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders, she found she could not stop thinking about him. There was something about the way he carried himself, even hunched over a wooden bowl in torn clothes, that did not match the rest of him. His hands, though dirty, did not have the calluses of a laborer. His posture, even seated, was straight in a way that seemed almost unconscious, as though years of training had shaped his spine before hardship reshaped his clothes. She shook her head against the thought. It was foolish to notice such things about a beggar. Hunger was making her imagine things, she told herself. Everyone in that kitchen was simply trying to survive, just as she was. There was no mystery here, only two unfortunate people sharing a warm fire on a cold night. Still, when sleep finally came, her last thought before darkness took her was the sound of his voice, low and rough, and the strange, careful way he had chosen his words. The next morning, Mira woke to the sound of church bells ringing in the distance, marking the hour. She rose stiffly from her bed of straw, her body aching from the cold ground, and splashed her face with water from a nearby well to make herself presentable. She had learned, over the past 6 months, that even the poor needed to appear clean if they wanted any chance at kindness. People gave more easily to someone who looked merely unfortunate than to someone who looked truly desperate. She spent the day doing what she always did, searching for any small work she could find. She helped an elderly woman carry baskets to the market in exchange for a few coins. She swept the steps of a shop in exchange for a piece of stale bread. By the time evening fell, she had earned barely enough to buy a single candle, and her stomach ached with a hunger that no amount of small jobs could satisfy. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep blue, she found herself walking, almost without deciding to, in the direction of Ashcombe Manor. She told herself it was simply because the kitchen there was the most reliable source of food she had found. She told herself the ragged man by the fire had nothing to do with her decision. She was lying to herself, and some small part of her knew it. The manor came into view as the last light faded from the sky, its tall windows glowing with warm candlelight, its stone walls rising like a fortress against the darkening horizon. Mira had heard whispers about this place in the town, about the duke who owned it, a man who had not been seen in public for nearly a year. Some said he was ill. Others said he was simply too proud to show his face after some scandal no one could quite name. The estate ran itself now, managed by stewards and servants, while its master remained hidden somewhere within, or perhaps not within at all. She did not care about the duke. She cared about the warm kitchen, and the kind cook who might, if she was lucky, spare another parcel of food. She approached the back door and knocked softly, the same way she had the night before. It took a moment before the door opened, and Agnes appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. "Back again," Agnes said, though there was no unkindness in her tone. "Come in quickly, before the cold follows you inside." Mira stepped into the kitchen, and the warmth wrapped around her like a blanket. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the smell of simmering soup filled the air. She glanced instinctively toward the corner, where the ragged man had sat the night before. He was there again, in the same spot, eating from the same kind of wooden bowl. This time, he looked up when she entered, and for the first time, their eyes met directly. His eyes were a pale gray, sharp and clear despite the dirt smudged across his face. They held hers for a long moment, longer than was comfortable, before he offered a small nod of greeting. "You came back," he said. "I am hungry," Mira replied simply, unwilling to admit that some other reason, one she could not quite name, had also drawn her feet toward this kitchen. "So am I," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, something almost amused, that made Mira wonder if he was speaking about food at all. Agnes handed her another small parcel, this time containing a bit of stew and a heel of bread still warm from the oven. Mira sat on the bench near the fire, the same spot as before, and began to eat slowly this time, savoring each bite rather than devouring it as she had the night before. The ragged man watched her for a moment, then reached for something beside him, a small piece of bread he had set aside from his own portion. Without a word, he held it out toward her. Mira looked at the offered bread, then at him, uncertain. "I have my own," she said, gesturing to the parcel in her lap. "Take it anyway," he said. "A man in my position understands what it means to have too little. It costs me nothing to share what I have with someone who understands the same hunger." There was something in his tone, a strange formality mixed with rough simplicity, that struck her as odd. Beggars did not usually speak this way, but she was too hungry and too tired to question it further. She accepted the bread and thanked him quietly. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the fire crackling between them, Agnes humming softly to herself as she prepared food for the following day. It was a strange, quiet peace, one that Mira had not felt in a long time. For 6 months, every moment of her life had been consumed by survival, by the constant, grinding fear of not knowing where her next meal would come from or where she would sleep that night. But here, in this kitchen, with the warmth of the fire and the strange comfort of a stranger's company, she felt something close to calm. "What is your name?" the man asked eventually, breaking the silence. Mira hesitated. She had learned to be careful about revealing too much of herself to strangers, especially strangers who might recognize her family name and pity her further, or worse, mock her for how far she had fallen. "Mira," she said finally, offering only the one word. "Mira," he repeated, as though testing the sound of it. "A good name." "And yours?" she asked, curiosity finally overcoming her caution. He paused for a moment, just long enough that Mira noticed the hesitation, before he answered. "Edmund," he said. "You may call me Edmund." Something about the way he said it, the slight pause before the name left his lips, made Mira wonder if it was truly his name at all. But she pushed the thought aside. Everyone in that kitchen had secrets, she reasoned. She had her own secrets, her own reasons for not revealing her full name or her past. It was only fair that he should have his as well. They continued to talk quietly as the evening wore on, though their conversation remained careful, each of them offering small pieces of themselves without revealing too much. Edmund asked about her life before hunger, and she told him only that she had once lived comfortably, that misfortune had taken everything from her, and that she now survived on whatever small kindness the world offered. He listened closely, his pale gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that seemed almost out of place for a man in his supposed position. When she finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment. "Misfortune has a way of humbling even the proudest of us," he said finally. "I understand more of what you describe than you might imagine." Mira looked at him curiously, wondering what kind of misfortune could have brought a man like him, whoever he truly was, to sit begging by a stranger's fire. But she did not ask. Some questions, she had learned, were better left unspoken, especially among people who had learned to guard their pasts as carefully as their present. As the night deepened, Agnes gently reminded them both that the kitchen would need to close soon, and that neither of them could risk being discovered by the household staff, who oversaw the estate's affairs. Mira gathered her things, thanked Agnes once more, and turned to leave. "Will you return tomorrow?" Edmund asked, his voice quiet. Mira paused at the door, considering the question longer than she expected to. "Perhaps," she said finally, "if hunger brings me back." "Then I hope hunger is generous," he replied, and there was the faintest hint of a smile beneath the dirt on his face, a smile that seemed strangely out of place on a beggar, too warm, too knowing, too full of quiet amusement for a man who claimed to have nothing. Mira stepped out into the cold night once more, her stomach fuller than it had been in weeks, but her mind more unsettled than it had been in months. As she walked back toward the abandoned shed she called home, she found herself thinking not of the food she had eaten, but of the strange man by the fire, and the strange, unplaced feeling that something about him was not at all what it appeared to be. She told herself, once again, that it did not matter. Whatever secrets Edmund carried were his own business, just as her own secrets were hers. Tomorrow, she would return to the kitchen for the food, and nothing more. But deep down, in a place she was not yet ready to admit to herself, she knew that was not entirely true. The wind picked up as she crossed the last field before reaching her shelter, carrying with it the first scent of rain. She quickened her pace, pulling her thin coat tighter, and did not look back toward the glowing windows of Ashcombe Manor behind her. If she had, she might have noticed a single candle burning in a high tower window, far above the kitchen, in a room no servant was permitted to enter, where a portrait of a stern, well-dressed nobleman hung above a cold, unused fireplace, waiting for its subject to return to the life he had, for reasons known only to himself, chosen to abandon. 3 days passed before Mira returned to the kitchen of Ashcombe Manor, though every one of those days she found her thoughts drifting back to the warmth of that fire and the strange, quiet man who called himself Edmund. She told herself it was only the food that drew her back, only the promise of a full stomach after weeks of scraps and stale bread. But somewhere beneath that reasoning, a smaller, quieter truth was beginning to take shape, one she was not yet ready to name. Rain had fallen steadily for 2 of those 3 days, turning the roads to mud and soaking through the thin shed where she slept. By the time the skies cleared on the 3rd evening, Mira was cold to the bone and hungrier than she had been in weeks. She made her way back toward the manor as the sun dipped behind the hills, her shoes squelching in the wet grass, her stomach twisting with each step. Agnes opened the door before Mira could even knock, as though she had been watching for her. "I wondered when you would come back," Agnes said, ushering her inside. The rain kept everyone indoors these past few days. Even Edmund did not come. Mira felt an odd flutter at the mention of his name, quickly followed by an equally odd flush of embarrassment at her own reaction. She said nothing, only nodded, and moved toward the fire to warm her hands. The kitchen was quieter than usual, the great hearth burning low, the pots and pans resting clean and unused on their shelves. Agnes moved to prepare a plate for her, speaking as she worked. "You should know," Agnes said carefully, not looking up from her task, "that I do not usually let strangers linger in my kitchen the way I have let the 2 of you. There is something about you both that made me want to help. But I will ask you plainly, Mira. Do you know anything of that man, where he comes from, what brought him so low?" Mira shook her head. "Only what he has told me, which is very little. Why do you ask?" Agnes hesitated, glancing toward the door, as though checking that no one else could hear. "There is something about him that troubles me. He speaks like a man who has read many books. He holds himself like a man who has never done a day of hard labor in his life, yet his clothes suggest otherwise. I have fed beggars for 11 years, child, and I have never met one quite like him." Mira considered this, turning Agnes's words over in her mind. She had noticed the same things herself, of course. The careful way he chose his words, the straightness of his back, even when hunched by the fire, the strange formality beneath his rough speech. But she had pushed those observations aside, as foolish imagination, the product of a hungry mind looking for mystery where there was none. Perhaps he was once a scholar, Mira offered, before misfortune found him, as it found me. "Perhaps," Agnes said, though she did not sound convinced. Before either of them could say more, the back door creaked open, and Edmund stepped inside, his ragged clothes damp from the last traces of rain, still clinging to the evening air. He nodded to Agnes, then his eyes found Mira, and something in his expression shifted, a flicker of warmth quickly hidden behind his usual careful composure. "I hoped you would return," he said, taking his usual seat by the fire. "The rain kept me away," Mira said, settling onto the bench across from him, the same distance as before, though tonight it felt slightly smaller, slightly less careful. "Rain has a way of keeping many things away," Edmund said, and there was something in his voice, a weight to the words, that suggested he was not only speaking of the weather. Agnes handed them both plates of food, warm stew with fresh bread, and retreated to the far side of the kitchen to give them a measure of privacy, though she remained within earshot, quietly watching the 2 of them from the corner of her eye as she cleaned pots that did not need cleaning. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly between them, before Edmund spoke again. "Tell me more of the life you lost," he said. "You mentioned comfort before misfortune. What kind of comfort? Mira considered how much to reveal. She had learned to guard her past carefully, afraid that revealing her family name might invite pity she could not bear, or worse, recognition from someone who had known her father and his debts. But something about the quiet sincerity in Edmund's question made her want to trust him, if only a little. "My father was a merchant," she said carefully, choosing her words with precision. "We lived well for many years. I had tutors, fine dresses, a home with more rooms than we knew what to do with. Then his business partners betrayed him, his investments failed, and debts piled higher than he could ever hope to repay. When he died, the creditors came within the week and took everything that remained." Edmund listened closely, his pale gray eyes fixed on her face, with an intensity that made her feel, strangely, both exposed and understood. "That must have been a difficult loss," he said quietly, "to go from such comfort to such hardship in so short a time." "And you?" Mira asked, turning the question back on him. "What misfortune brought you to this kitchen? Edmund, you speak like a man who once knew better circumstances himself." For a moment, Edmund said nothing, his gaze drifting toward the fire, as though searching for the right words among the flames. Mira watched him carefully, noting the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his hands, resting on his knees, curled briefly into loose fists before relaxing again. "I once had responsibilities," he said finally, his voice carefully measured. "Great responsibilities, greater than I felt prepared to carry. There came a point where the weight of those responsibilities became more than I could bear, and I chose, for a time, to set them aside and live as a man without a name, without a title, without the expectations that came with either." Mira frowned slightly, turning his words over. "That sounds less like misfortune and more like a choice." Edmund's lips curved into a small, tired smile. Perhaps it was both. Sometimes the greatest misfortune is discovering that the life you were given does not fit the person you have become. There was a depth to his words that unsettled Mira, a weight that seemed far too heavy for a simple beggar to carry. She wanted to press further, to ask what responsibilities he meant, what title he had abandoned, but something in his expression told her he had already revealed more than he intended, and pushing further might close the small door he had just opened. Instead, she asked a simpler question. "Do you ever wish to go back, to reclaim whatever you left behind?" Edmund considered this for a long moment before answering. "Some days, yes. Other days, I fear what returning would mean. Here, in this kitchen, with nothing but a bowl of stew and a fire to warm me, I am simply a man. Out there," he gestured vaguely toward the door, toward the world beyond the kitchen, "I am something else entirely, something that comes with expectations I am not certain I can meet." Mira studied him, trying to reconcile the ragged, dirt-streaked man before her with the weight of his words. There was a sadness in him, buried beneath the careful composure, a loneliness that seemed to run far deeper than mere hunger or poverty. "Whatever you left behind," she said softly, "I imagine it must be difficult to carry the burden of choosing between two entirely different lives." "You understand more than most," Edmund said, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "Perhaps that is why I find myself glad, each time you return to this kitchen. There are very few people in this world who see me simply as a man, without asking what I am worth, or what I can offer them." Mira felt her cheeks warm at his words, though she was not entirely certain why. She had grown accustomed, over the past 6 months, to being seen only as a burden, a beggar, someone to be pitied or dismissed. To be seen, instead, as simply a person worth speaking to, worth understanding, was a feeling she had almost forgotten. "I see you the same way you see me, then," she said quietly, "simply as a person, nothing more, nothing less." They sat together for a while longer, speaking of smaller things, the weather, the food, small memories of happier times, before their respective misfortunes had reshaped their lives. Agnes, watching quietly from across the kitchen, could not help but notice the way the two of them leaned slightly toward each other as they spoke, the way their conversation flowed easily, despite the careful walls each of them still maintained around their pasts. As the evening grew late, Agnes gently reminded them that the kitchen needed to close for the night, and the two rose reluctantly from their seats by the fire. "Will you return again soon?" Edmund asked as Mira gathered her things. "I believe I will," Mira said, And for the first time, she admitted to herself, quietly, that it was not only hunger drawing her back to this kitchen, but something else entirely, something she was still too cautious to name. "Then I will look forward to it," Edmund said, and the warmth in his voice followed her out into the cold night air, staying with her long after the manor's glowing windows had faded from view behind her. As she walked home through the darkness, her thoughts churned with questions she had no answers to. What responsibilities had Edmund abandoned? What title had he set aside to live as a beggar in a stranger's kitchen? She turned the mystery over in her mind, again and again, unable to shake the growing suspicion that there was far more to this ragged, quiet man than he had yet revealed. She did not know, as she made her way back to her small shelter that night, that far above the kitchen, where she had shared bread and quiet conversation, in a locked study within the manor's east wing, a steward named Mr. Whitfield sat at a heavy oak desk, reviewing letters addressed to a master who had not been seen in the manor's grand halls for nearly a year. Among those letters was one from the Duke's own sister, growing increasingly urgent in its tone, demanding to know when her brother intended to return to his duties, to his title, and to the life he had so mysteriously abandoned. Mr. Whitfield had his suspicions about where the Duke had been spending his evenings, suspicions he had wisely kept to himself. He had noticed, more than once, the kitchen's fire burning later than usual, had heard, through servants who dared not speak too loudly, whispers of a ragged man who visited Agnes's kitchen at odd hours. He said nothing to anyone, choosing instead to wait and watch, curious to see how long his master's quiet rebellion against his own life might continue, and what, or who, might eventually draw him back. Over the following weeks, the visits to Agnes's kitchen became something closer to routine than either Mira or Edmund had originally intended. What began as a desperate search for food slowly transformed into something neither of them fully understood, an anchor point in two lives otherwise adrift, a small pocket of warmth in a world that had shown both of them very little kindness. Mira found herself counting the days between her visits, and though she still told herself the food was the reason, she no longer quite believed it. She began taking more care with her appearance, before making the walk to the manor, smoothing her hair, brushing the dust from her worn dress, small gestures that made little practical difference, but mattered to her all the same. Edmund, for his part, seemed to look forward to her visits with equal anticipation. Agnes noticed the way his posture straightened slightly whenever the back door creaked open, the way his eyes would search the doorway before recognizing her, followed by a small, involuntary softening of his expression that he could not quite hide. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after their first meeting, Mira arrived to find the kitchen unusually quiet. Agnes was nowhere to be seen, having been called away to assist with preparations elsewhere in the manor, leaving only Edmund seated by the fire, a single candle burning on the table beside him. "Agnes has left us alone tonight," he said, as she entered, a note of amusement in his voice. "I hope you do not mind my company without her watchful presence." "I do not mind," Mira said, settling onto her usual spot on the bench, though she found herself suddenly more aware of the quiet intimacy of the empty kitchen, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows across Edmund's face. They ate together in comfortable silence for a time, the only sounds the crackling fire and the distant murmur of the manor settling around them. Eventually, Edmund set aside his empty bowl and studied her, with an expression she had not quite seen from him before. Something searching, something almost vulnerable. "May I ask you something, Mira?" he said. "Something perhaps too forward for a man in my position to ask?" "You may ask," she said, curiosity mixing with a faint nervousness she could not quite explain. "Do you ever wonder," he began slowly, "what our lives might have looked like, had misfortune never found either of us? Do you imagine yourself still living in comfort, married perhaps, surrounded by the kind of security you once knew?" Mira considered the question carefully. It was not one she allowed herself to dwell on often. The temptation to imagine a life that no longer existed was a dangerous one, capable of deepening her grief over what she had lost, rather than helping her survive what remained. "Sometimes," she admitted, "though I try not to dwell on it too long. Imagining what might have been rarely helps me face what is." "A wise approach," Edmund said quietly, "though I confess I find myself imagining such things more often than I should. I wonder, sometimes, what kind of man I might have become, had I never set aside the life I was given. Do you regret setting it aside? Mira asked, watching his face carefully for any flicker of the truth he still kept hidden from her. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the fire, before he answered. There are moments I regret it deeply, and there are moments, like this one, when I find myself grateful beyond words that circumstances brought me to this kitchen, to this fire, and to your company. Mira felt her heart quicken at his words, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire before them. She was careful, always careful, about allowing herself to feel too much for anyone, having learned the hard way how quickly comfort could be stripped away. But something about the sincerity in Edmund's voice, the quiet vulnerability in his pale gray eyes, made it difficult to maintain her usual guarded distance. I find myself grateful for this kitchen as well, she admitted softly. Grateful, and perhaps something more than grateful, though I am not certain I should say so. Say it, Edmund said gently, leaning slightly toward her. I would very much like to hear it. Mira hesitated, torn between her natural caution and the growing warmth in her chest that urged her forward. I find myself looking forward to seeing you, Edmund, more than I expected to, given the circumstances that brought us together. A quiet smile spread across Edmund's face, one that seemed to hold both relief and something deeper, something he seemed almost afraid to name aloud. I feel precisely the same way, Mira. Precisely the same. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the fire crackling softly between them, the weight of their unspoken feelings settling comfortably into the quiet space of the kitchen. It was Edmund who finally broke the silence, though his next words carried a different weight entirely. There is something I have not told you, he said carefully. Something about my past that I have kept hidden, not out of dishonesty, but out of fear. Mira's chest tightened slightly at his words, a small warning bell sounding somewhere in the back of her mind. You do not owe me your secrets, Edmund. I have my own, that I have not fully shared with you. Perhaps not, he said, but I find myself wanting to share this one with you, if you will allow it. Before he could continue, however, the back door creaked open, and Agnes returned, flustered and slightly out of breath, muttering about the demands of the upper household staff. The moment between them dissolved as quickly as it had formed, and Edmund's expression shifted back into its usual careful composure. The vulnerability he had briefly shown, carefully tucked away once more. Forgive my absence, Agnes said, moving quickly to check on the fire and the remaining food. The steward required my assistance with the preparations for the coming season. There is talk, she added, glancing between the two of them, that the Duke may finally be returning to take up his duties properly. The whole household is in an uproar preparing for it. Mira glanced at Edmund at the mention of the Duke, curious to see if the topic held any particular interest for him, but his expression remained carefully neutral, giving nothing away. Is that so? He said simply, returning his attention to the fire. Indeed, Agnes continued, oblivious to any deeper meaning in the exchange. There is to be a grand ball, they say, once he returns, to celebrate his resumption of his duties. The whole town will be talking of nothing else for weeks. Mira listened with mild interest, though the idea of a grand ball at Ashcombe Manor felt as distant and unreachable to her as the moon itself. Such events belonged to a world she no longer had any place in, a world of fine dresses and polished manners that had been stripped from her, along with everything else her father's debts had claimed. The conversation moved on to smaller matters, the price of flour, the coming harvest, the usual concerns of a working kitchen, and the strange, charged moment between Mira and Edmund faded into the comfortable background of the evening. But Mira found herself returning to it in her thoughts as she made her way home that night, wondering what secret Edmund had been on the verge of revealing before Agnes's return had interrupted him. She wondered, too, about the sudden mention of the Duke's return, and the flicker of something unreadable that had crossed Edmund's face at the mention of it, quickly hidden, but not quite quick enough to escape her notice entirely. She told herself it meant nothing, that perhaps he simply resented the reminder of the wealth and privilege that existed just beyond the walls of the kitchen, where he now sat as a beggar, but some small, persistent part of her mind refused to let the thought rest easily. Over the following days, Mira found herself paying closer attention to the small details of Edmund's behavior, the careful way he sometimes caught himself before revealing too much, the flicker of something knowing in his eyes whenever the subject of the estate or its absent master arose. She told herself she was imagining connections that did not exist, that hunger and loneliness were making her see mysteries in a man who was, in truth, simply another unfortunate soul like herself. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it would not be long before it began to grow into something she could no longer ignore. The following week brought an unexpected change to Mira's circumstances. While searching for work near the town square, she overheard a seamstress named Nora complaining loudly to a shopkeeper about the shortage of skilled hands available to help prepare gowns for the household staff ahead of the household's coming celebrations. Sensing an opportunity, Mira approached the woman directly, offering her services, despite having little formal training beyond what her mother had taught her years ago, before misfortune had stripped away every comfort of her former life. Nora, desperate for help and running short on time before the grand ball everyone in town seemed to be speaking of, agreed to take her on for a modest wage, enough to secure Mira a proper room above the seamstress's shop, rather than the cold, abandoned shed she had been sleeping in for months. For the first time since her father's death, Mira felt a small flicker of stability returning to her life, and she threw herself into the work with a gratitude that surprised even her. Despite her new circumstances, she continued her visits to Agnes's kitchen whenever her schedule allowed, though now she came not out of desperate hunger, but out of a genuine desire to see Edmund and share in the quiet comfort of their evenings together by the fire. The nature of their meetings had shifted subtly over the following days, becoming less about survival and more about companionship, though the weight of unspoken truths still lingered between them, a shadow neither had yet found the courage to fully address. One evening, as Mira sat mending a torn hem by candlelight in her new room above the shop, Nora entered carrying an armful of fine fabric, her expression harried and distracted. "I need every capable hand I can find," Nora said, setting the fabric down on the work table. "The Duke's sister has sent word that her brother intends to return within the fortnight, and the household wants every gown prepared before the grand ball meant to welcome him back. You have a steady hand, Mira. Would you be willing to help with the finer details, the embroidery and beadwork the other girls cannot manage as quickly?" Mira agreed readily, grateful for the additional wages the extra work would bring, though the mention of the Duke's imminent return sent an odd, unplaceable unease through her chest. She thought again of Edmund's careful reaction whenever the topic arose, the flicker of something guarded in his pale gray eyes, and wondered, not for the first time, what exactly lay behind his reluctance to discuss the estate's absent master. Over the following days, Mira found herself spending long hours at the seamstress's shop, working alongside Nora and two other young women to complete the elaborate gowns commissioned by various households eager to attend the grand celebration. The work was demanding but satisfying, a welcome distraction from the uncertainty that still colored much of her life, and she found a quiet pride in watching each gown take shape beneath her careful stitches. It was during one such evening, as she worked late into the night, finishing delicate embroidery along the hem of a deep blue gown commissioned for a minor noblewoman, that Nora mentioned something that caused Mira's hands to still entirely. "You should have seen the household in an uproar today," Nora said, shaking her head as she folded a length of silk. "The steward came by personally to collect the finest gown we have completed, insisting it be delivered directly to the manor itself, rather than waiting for the usual collection. He said the Duke wishes for everything to be in perfect order the moment he arrives, down to the smallest detail." "The steward came himself?" Mira asked, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "Indeed," Nora said. "A stern sort of man, Mr. Whitfield, always so particular about every arrangement. He mentioned, in passing, that the Duke has been staying at a private residence some distance from the manor these past months, tending to matters of health, though the servants whisper it is something else entirely that kept him away so long." Mira listened carefully, filing away each small detail even as she told herself it had nothing to do with Edmund, that the connection her mind kept trying to draw between the two men was nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination, shaped by too many quiet evenings spent wondering about a stranger's hidden past. "What do the servants whisper then?" Mira asked, unable to fully suppress her curiosity. Nora lowered her voice conspiratorially, leaning closer across the work table. "Some say he suffered a great heartbreak that drove him away from society entirely. Others say he grew tired of the endless demands of his title and sought solitude somewhere far from prying eyes. Whatever the truth, he is said to be a private man, difficult to read, and the household staff seemed equally nervous and excited about his return. Mira nodded absently, her thoughts drifting, despite her best efforts to remain focused on the conversation. That evening, after finishing her work at the shop, she made her way to Agnes's kitchen, eager to see Edmund, despite the strange unease that had settled over her since hearing Nora's words. He was there as always, seated by the fire, though something in his posture that evening seemed different, more guarded, as though he carried some private weight he had not yet found the words to share. "You seem troubled tonight," Mira observed, settling onto her usual bench across from him. Edmund glanced up, offering a small, tired smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Merely tired. There is much on my mind these days." "Is it the Duke's return you are thinking of?" Mira asked carefully, watching his reaction closely. Something flickered across Edmund's face, quickly masked but not quite quick enough to escape her notice. "Why would the Duke's affairs concern a man in my position?" "I only ask because the whole town speaks of little else," Mira said, choosing her words carefully. "And because you have reacted strangely each time the subject has arisen between us." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the fire, before he finally spoke. "The Duke's return complicates matters for many people in this household, myself included, though not in the way you might imagine." "What do you mean by that?" Mira pressed gently, sensing that whatever secret Edmund had been carrying since their earlier conversation was finally close to the surface. "There is much I have not told you about myself," Edmund said slowly, his gaze finally meeting hers directly. "Much that I fear may change how you see me, should I reveal it." Mira's heart quickened, uncertain whether she wanted to hear whatever confession he seemed on the verge of making. "Whatever you tell me, Edmund, I do not believe it will change the person I have come to know these past weeks." Edmund studied her face for a long moment, as though searching for the courage to finally speak the truth he had kept hidden. But before he could say another word, the back door of the kitchen swung open sharply, and a stern-faced man in fine, formal clothing stepped inside, his eyes immediately fixing on Edmund with an expression of barely concealed relief, mixed with irritation. "There you are," the man said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed entirely out of place, addressed toward a ragged beggar seated by a kitchen fire. "I have been searching the grounds for you for the better part of an hour. Your sister has sent another letter, insisting on your immediate return to prepare for tomorrow's arrangements." Mira stared at the exchange in stunned confusion, watching as Edmund's expression shifted from surprise to something like resignation, his shoulders sagging slightly, as though a great weight had settled upon them once more. "Mr. Whitfield," Edmund said, his voice suddenly carrying a different quality entirely, a note of quiet authority that Mira had never heard from him before. "I asked you not to seek me out here." Mira's mind raced, trying desperately to make sense of what she was witnessing. The steward, Mr. Whitfield, the very man Nora had mentioned earlier that evening, was addressing the ragged beggar by the fire with a familiarity and respect that made no sense at all, unless the connection her mind had been quietly forming over the past weeks was, in fact, entirely true. "Your Grace," Mr. Whitfield said, his tone carrying a note of gentle reproach, "the household cannot continue operating without your guidance much longer. Tomorrow's ball cannot proceed without your presence properly arranged." The words hung in the air of the kitchen like a physical weight, and Mira felt the ground shift beneath her, the careful, comfortable world she had built around her quiet evenings, with Edmund collapsing instantly into something entirely unrecognizable. Edmund, no, not Edmund at all, closed his eyes briefly, as though bracing himself for what he knew must come next, before finally turning to face Mira directly, his pale gray eyes carrying an apology he had clearly hoped to offer under very different circumstances. "Mira," he began softly, "I owe you the truth I should have shared with you long before this moment arrived, to force my hand." Mira sat frozen on the bench, her mind struggling to reconcile the ragged man she had shared bread and quiet conversation with, these past weeks with the title Mr. Whitfield had just spoken aloud. "Your Grace." The words echoed through her thoughts, refusing to settle into any shape she could accept. "You are the Duke," she said slowly, the words tasting strange and unfamiliar on her tongue. "The master of this entire estate, the man the whole town has been waiting to see return." "Yes," Edmund said quietly, and even now, even with his true identity laid bare before her, his voice retained the same careful, measured quality she had come to know so well. My name is Edmund Ashcombe. I am the Duke of this estate, and I have deceived you these past weeks, though never with the intention of causing you harm." Mira rose from the bench, her legs unsteady beneath her, anger and betrayal rising hot in her chest, even as confusion continued to swirl through her mind. "You let me believe you were a beggar. You let me pity you, share what little food I could spare, speak to you of my own hardships as though we were equals, suffering the same fate." "Mira, please," Edmund said, rising as well, though he made no move to close the distance between them. "I never intended for the deception to last this long, nor did I intend for it to become what it has become between us." "What has it become, then?" Mira demanded, her voice sharper than she had ever used with him before. A cruel game for a bored nobleman, amusing himself at the expense of a woman who had nothing left to lose? "No," Edmund said firmly, taking a step toward her, despite the anger flashing in her eyes. "Never that. Mira, I disguised myself not to mock you or anyone else, but because I had grown so weary of being seen only as a title, only as a name and a fortune, that I could no longer bear the weight of it. I sought this kitchen not to deceive you, but to escape, if only for a few hours each evening, the endless expectations that come with the life I was born into." Agnes, who had been standing quietly by the hearth throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "Perhaps this conversation deserves privacy, Your Grace. I will see that Mr. Whitfield waits outside." Mr. Whitfield, still standing near the door, hesitated only a moment before nodding and stepping back out into the cold night air, leaving Edmund, Agnes, and Mira alone once more, within the warm kitchen, though the comfortable intimacy of earlier evenings had been shattered entirely. "Explain yourself," Mira said, crossing her arms tightly across her chest, though her voice trembled slightly, despite her attempt at composure. "Tell me why a duke would choose to live as a beggar in his own kitchen for weeks on end." Edmund sighed heavily, running a hand through his still unkempt hair before answering. "My father died 3 years ago, leaving me this title and this estate far sooner than I had ever prepared for. I was young, unprepared, and utterly overwhelmed by the sudden weight of responsibility placed upon my shoulders. Every decision I made was scrutinized, every word I spoke measured against the legacy my father left behind. I felt as though I existed only as an extension of this title, this estate, this name, rather than as a person in my own right." "So you ran away," Mira said flatly. "I disappeared for a time," Edmund corrected gently. "I left the estate in the capable hands of Mr. Whitfield and my stewards, and I sought out a life where no one knew my name, where I could simply exist as a man among other men, judged only by my character rather than my title. I found my way to this kitchen quite by accident, drawn by hunger during one of my early wanderings, and Agnes was kind enough to feed me without asking questions. I never asked because I did not wish to know," Agnes admitted quietly from the corner. "I assumed only that you were a man who needed help, and that was reason enough for me to offer it." Edmund nodded gratefully toward her, before returning his attention to Mira. "And then you arrived, Mira, hungry and proud in equal measure, and something about you, your resilience, despite your own hardships, your refusal to let misfortune fully break your spirit, drew me back to this kitchen, night after night, far more than hunger alone ever could." Mira felt her anger warring, with the softening effect of his words, though she was not yet ready to fully release the betrayal still burning in her chest. "You allowed me to believe we were equals, Edmund. You allowed me to share my deepest hardships with you, thinking you understood them as a fellow sufferer, when in truth, you could have ended your own hardship the moment you chose to reclaim your title." "That is true," Edmund admitted, his expression pained, "and I am deeply sorry for the deception, Mira. Truly I am. But please understand, the connection we built these past weeks was never false, not on my part. Every conversation, every moment of comfort I found in your company, was entirely genuine, perhaps more genuine than anything I have experienced in my life as the Duke of Ashcombe." Mira turned away from him, moving toward the window, staring out into the darkness beyond the glass, as she tried to steady her racing thoughts. Behind her, she heard Edmund take a hesitant step closer, though he did not close the distance fully. "I understand if you cannot forgive this deception," he said quietly. "I understand if you wish never to see me again, now that you know the truth of who I am. But I could not allow you to walk away from this kitchen tonight, without knowing the full truth, without knowing that whatever grew between us these past weeks was real. regardless of the name I gave myself. Mira remained silent for a long moment, her mind a chaotic swirl of anger, confusion, and something else entirely, something she was not yet ready to name. Finally, she turned back to face him, her expression carefully guarded. "I need time, Edmund," she said quietly. "Time to understand what has happened here, and what, if anything, remains true between us, now that I know who you truly are." Edmund nodded slowly, respect and understanding evident in his expression, despite the clear pain the moment caused him. "Take whatever time you need, Mira. I will not press you further tonight. But know that I do not wish for this to be the end of whatever we have found together in this kitchen." Mira gathered her things without another word, moving toward the door with careful, measured steps, her mind still reeling from the revelation that had upended everything she thought she understood about the past weeks of her life. As she reached the door, she paused, glancing back one final time at the man she had known as Edmund, now revealed as the Duke of Ashcombe himself. "Good night, Your Grace," she said, the title feeling strange and heavy on her tongue, before stepping out into the cold darkness beyond. Mr. Whitfield waited near the entrance, his expression carefully neutral as she passed, though his eyes followed her with a curiosity he did not voice aloud. Mira walked quickly away from the manor, her thoughts a storm of conflicting emotions, betrayal and understanding, anger and lingering affection, all tangled together in a knot she could not yet begin to unravel. The walk back to her small room above the seamstress's shop felt longer than usual that night, the weight of the evening's revelations pressing heavily upon her with every step. She thought of every conversation she had shared with Edmund over the past weeks, every moment of warmth and understanding she had believed to be built between two equally unfortunate souls. Now, knowing the truth of his identity, she found herself questioning everything, wondering how much of what had passed between them had been genuine, and how much had simply been the amusement of a bored nobleman playing at poverty, while she had genuinely suffered its weight. Yet even as her anger simmered, she could not fully deny the sincerity she had witnessed in his eyes as he confessed the truth, nor the genuine pain that had crossed his features at the thought of losing whatever connection they had built together. The contradiction troubled her deeply as she climbed the narrow stairs to her small room and settled onto her bed, staring up at the shadowed ceiling above her, sleep refusing to come easily, as the events of the evening replayed endlessly in her mind. Tomorrow, she knew, the grand ball would proceed as planned, and the entire town would finally see the return of the Duke they had waited so long to welcome back. She wondered, with a strange mixture of dread and curiosity, what that return would mean for her, and for whatever fragile connection remained between herself and the man she had known, however briefly, simply as Edmund. Morning arrived with a gray, uncertain light, and Mira woke to find her body exhausted despite the hours she had spent lying awake through the night. Nora knocked on her door shortly after sunrise, her voice carrying an urgency that pulled Mira reluctantly from her tangled thoughts. "There is no time to rest today," Nora called through the door. "The final gown must be delivered to the manor before noon, and I need your steady hands to finish the last of the beadwork before it goes." Mira dressed quickly, grateful for the distraction of work, though her mind remained fixed on the events of the previous evening. She had barely begun to process the revelation of Edmund's true identity, and now she found herself facing the very real possibility of returning to the manor itself, into the heart of the household preparing to welcome its master home. She joined Nora and the other seamstresses in the workshop, carefully finishing the last delicate stitches on a deep green gown commissioned for the household's welcome celebration. The morning passed in a blur of careful, focused work, though Mira's thoughts continually drifted back to the pale gray eyes and quiet voice of the man she had known, until only hours ago, simply as a fellow beggar sharing her hardship. By midday, Nora gathered the finished gowns carefully into protective wrapping and turned to Mira with an apologetic expression. "I am needed elsewhere this afternoon," Nora said, "and I have no one else available to deliver these to the manor. Would you be willing to make the delivery yourself? The steward is expecting them before the household's guests begin arriving this evening." Mira hesitated, her chest tightening at the thought of returning to the manor so soon after the previous night's revelations. But she could see no reasonable way to refuse without arousing Nora's suspicion, and so she agreed, gathering the carefully wrapped gowns into her arms and making her way toward Ashcombe Manor once more, though this time through the grand front entrance rather than the humble kitchen door she had grown so accustomed to using. The manor, viewed from its main approach, was even more imposing than she had imagined during her evening visits to its kitchen. Tall stone columns flanked the entrance, and servants moved briskly across the grounds, preparing for the evening's grand celebration, with an energy that seemed to fill the very air with anticipation. A young footman met her at the door, taking the wrapped gowns from her arms with practiced efficiency, before disappearing into the manor's interior. Mira lingered near the entrance for a moment, uncertain whether her task was complete, or whether some further instruction awaited her. "You may wait here," the footman said upon returning, "in case any final adjustments are required before this evening." Mira nodded, and stepped into a small antechamber near the entrance, taking a seat on a cushioned bench as she waited. The room was elegantly furnished, portraits of stern-faced ancestors lining the walls, and Mira found herself studying one portrait in particular, a younger man, with familiar pale gray eyes, and a proud, composed bearing that bore little resemblance to the ragged beggar she had come to know over the past weeks. "That is my father," a familiar voice said from the doorway, and Mira turned sharply to find Edmund standing there, dressed now in fine, tailored clothing that transformed him almost entirely from the man she had known. His hair had been cut and neatly styled, his face cleanly shaven, revealing sharp, aristocratic features that had been entirely hidden beneath weeks of dirt and unkempt beard. Mira rose from the bench, uncertain how to address him now, caught between the familiarity of their shared evenings and the undeniable weight of his true position. "Your Grace," she began carefully, though Edmund shook his head immediately. "Please," he said, taking a step closer. "Do not address me so formally, Mira. Not after everything we have shared. I would much prefer you continue to call me Edmund, if you are willing." "I am not certain what I am willing to do just yet," Mira admitted honestly. "Everything I believed about you these past weeks has been upended entirely." Edmund nodded, understanding evident in his expression. "I do not ask for your forgiveness immediately, Mira. I only ask that you allow me the chance to prove that the man you came to know in that kitchen, however he presented himself, was genuinely myself, stripped of all the expectations and pretense that come with this title." Before Mira could respond, a stern-faced woman appeared in the doorway behind Edmund, her fine dress and confident bearing marking her immediately as someone of considerable importance within the household. Her eyes moved between Edmund and Mira with obvious curiosity, though her expression remained carefully composed. "Edmund," the woman said, "the guests will begin arriving within the hour. You must finish preparing yourself properly before they do." "Of course, Colette," Edmund replied, though his eyes remained fixed on Mira, even as he addressed his sister. "This is Mira. She has been assisting with the preparations for tonight's celebration." Lady Colette studied Mira with an appraising gaze that made her feel suddenly conscious of her simple, worn dress amid the manor's elegant surroundings. "A pleasure," Colette said politely, though her tone carried an unmistakable note of curiosity regarding her brother's evident interest in this particular young seamstress's assistant. "The pleasure is mine, my lady," Mira replied carefully, offering a small, respectful curtsy, despite the awkwardness of the moment. Colette lingered a moment longer, her gaze shifting between the two of them with growing curiosity, before finally excusing herself to attend to other preparations, leaving Edmund and Mira alone once more in the elegant antechamber. "Your sister seems curious about our acquaintance," Mira observed once Colette had departed. "My sister is curious about everything concerning my recent absence," Edmund said with a small, weary smile. "She has sent no fewer than a dozen letters these past months, each more insistent than the last, demanding my return to my duties. And now you have returned," Mira said quietly. "Fully, it seems, into the life you once found so difficult to bear." Edmund's expression grew more serious. "I have returned to my responsibilities, yes, because I understand now that I cannot forever avoid the duties my birth has placed upon me. But I do not intend to abandon the lessons I learned during my time away, nor the connections I built while living, however briefly, as simply a man among equals." Mira studied him carefully, searching his expression for any hint of insincerity, though she found only earnest conviction reflected in his pale gray eyes. "What connections do you refer to, precisely?" "You, Mira," Edmund said simply, taking a step closer, though he stopped short of closing the distance entirely between them. "I refer to you, and to whatever has grown between us these past weeks, however complicated the circumstances of our meeting may have been." Mira felt her chest tighten at his words, torn between the lingering hurt of his deception and the undeniable warmth that still stirred within her at his nearness. Tonight, an entire household of guests will gather to celebrate your return, Edmund. Surely you understand how impossible it would be for someone in your position to maintain any genuine connection with a woman in mine. I understand the difficulties, Edmund acknowledged, but I do not believe them insurmountable. I have spent months living without the protection of my title, learning firsthand the value of connections built on genuine character rather than circumstance or birth. I do not intend to forget that lesson, simply because circumstance has forced my return to this life. Before Mira could respond, the footman returned, informing Edmund that further preparations required his immediate attention before the evening's guests began arriving. Edmund hesitated, clearly reluctant to end their conversation, before finally offering Mira a small, respectful bow. "Will you attend tonight's celebration?" he asked before departing. "I would very much like the chance to speak with you further, away from the pressures of tonight's obligations." "I was not invited as a guest," Mira said carefully. "I came only to deliver the gowns commissioned for tonight's celebration." "Then allow me to invite you properly," Edmund said, his tone carrying a quiet earnestness that made her chest tighten further. "Please, Mira, attend tonight, not as a servant delivering gowns, but as my guest." Mira hesitated, uncertain whether accepting such an invitation would only complicate the already tangled situation between them further. But something in Edmund's expression, the genuine hope reflected in his pale gray eyes, made it difficult to refuse entirely. "I will consider it," she said finally, offering no firmer commitment than that. Edmund nodded, accepting her hesitant answer with quiet grace, before finally departing to complete his preparations for the evening ahead, leaving Mira alone once more in the elegant antechamber, her mind swirling with uncertainty about what the coming hours might bring. Mira left the manor that afternoon with her thoughts still tangled in confusion, uncertain whether to return that evening as Edmund had requested, or to retreat entirely from a situation that seemed to grow more complicated with every passing hour. She made her way back to the seamstress's shop, where Nora greeted her with obvious curiosity about the lengthy delay in her return. "You were gone longer than expected," Nora observed, studying Mira's distracted expression with growing curiosity. "Did something happen at the manor?" Mira hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal of the strange events that had unfolded since the previous evening. "The household is simply very busy with preparations," she said carefully, choosing to withhold the full truth of her acquaintance with the Duke for now. Nora seemed to accept this explanation readily enough, too occupied with her own preparations for the evening to press further, and Mira retreated to her small room above the shop, her mind still churning with indecision about whether to accept Edmund's invitation. As the afternoon wore on, she found herself standing before the small, cracked mirror in her room, studying her reflection critically. Her dress, though clean, was simple and worn, entirely unsuited for a grand celebration among the county's finest families. She possessed nothing appropriate to wear to such an event, and the thought of arriving in her current attire, surrounded by guests dressed in silk and fine jewels, filled her with a familiar, uncomfortable shame. Yet even as practical concerns weighed against attending, she found herself unable to fully abandon the pull she felt toward accepting Edmund's invitation. The weeks they had spent together in Agnes's kitchen, however built upon deception, had left an undeniable mark upon her heart, one she could not simply dismiss, despite the anger and confusion still lingering from the previous night's revelations. As evening approached, a soft knock sounded at her door, and Mira opened it to find Nora standing there, holding a beautifully finished gown that Mira immediately recognized as one they had been commissioned to alter earlier that week for a young noblewoman who had since decided against attending the celebration. "This gown no longer has an owner," Nora said, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. "It seems a shame to let such fine work go unworn tonight, especially when I suspect you may have somewhere important to be." Mira stared at the gown, a deep shade of blue that would complement her dark hair beautifully, before looking back at Nora with surprise. "How did you know?" "I have eyes, child," Nora said with a small laugh, "and I have seen the way you have returned from your visits to that manor these past weeks, with a particular kind of distraction in your expression. Whatever has drawn you there, I suspect tonight may be an important night for you." Mira accepted the gown gratefully, emotion tightening her throat as she considered the kindness Nora was extending toward her. "Thank you," she said softly. "I do not know how to repay such generosity." "Simply wear it well," Nora said, "and perhaps tell me the full story, once whatever mystery surrounds your recent behavior has finally resolved itself." Mira dressed carefully that evening, the fine fabric of the gown feeling strange and unfamiliar against her skin. After months of wearing only simple, worn clothing, she studied her reflection in the small mirror once more, hardly recognizing the transformation the elegant gown brought to her appearance, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to remember the young woman she had once been, before misfortune had stripped away every comfort of her former life. The walk to the manor that evening felt entirely different from her previous visits, the grand front entrance now blazing with candlelight, and alive with the sound of music and laughter drifting from within. Carriages lined the long approach, delivering guests dressed in the finest silks and jewels the county could offer, and Mira felt a familiar flutter of nervousness as she approached the entrance, uncertain whether she truly belonged among such elegant company. A footman at the entrance checked her name against a list of expected guests, and Mira held her breath, uncertain whether Edmund had truly followed through on his promise to include her among the evening's invited company. To her relief, the footman nodded and stepped aside, allowing her entrance into the grand hall beyond. The ballroom itself was more magnificent than anything Mira had witnessed even during the more comfortable years of her own childhood. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead, casting warm light across polished marble floors, while an orchestra played softly in one corner, and guests moved gracefully through the elegant space, engaged in animated conversation and laughter. Mira lingered near the edge of the grand room, uncertain where to position herself among such unfamiliar company, when a familiar voice drew her attention from across the crowded space. "You came," Edmund said, approaching with an expression of evident relief and pleasure, dressed now in formal attire that emphasized his tall, composed bearing, entirely differently than the ragged clothing she had grown accustomed to seeing him wear. "I confess, I was uncertain you would." "Nora provided the gown," Mira admitted, gesturing slightly to the fine blue fabric she wore. "Without her generosity, I would have had no appropriate attire to attend such a gathering." "You look lovely," Edmund said sincerely, his pale gray eyes studying her with an admiration that made her cheeks warm, despite her lingering uncertainty about their situation. Before Mira could respond, a hush fell gradually across the grand room as the orchestra concluded its current piece, and all eyes turned expectantly toward Edmund, standing now at the center of the gathering. Mira watched as he straightened his posture, his expression shifting subtly into the composed, authoritative bearing befitting his title, and she realized, with a small pang of unease, just how completely the burden of his position transformed him in the presence of others. "Friends," Edmund began, addressing the assembled guests with practiced ease, "I thank you all for joining us tonight, to celebrate my return to the responsibilities I have, for a time, set aside. I understand that my absence has caused concern among many of you, and I offer my sincere gratitude for your patience and continued loyalty during my time away." The guests responded with polite applause, and Edmund continued speaking briefly about his renewed commitment to his duties as Duke, his words carefully measured and diplomatic in a manner entirely different from the quiet, unguarded conversations Mira had shared with him in Agnes's kitchen. She watched from the edge of the crowd, feeling suddenly small and out of place amid the grandeur surrounding her, uncertain whether the man addressing the room with such practiced authority bore any true resemblance to the ragged beggar who had shared his bread with her so many weeks ago. As the evening progressed, Edmund found himself repeatedly drawn away by various guests, eager for his attention, stewards requiring his approval on various matters, and members of the county's finest families seeking to re-establish connections following his lengthy absence. Mira watched from a distance as he moved gracefully through these obligations, his easy charm and composed bearing earning him admiration from every corner of the grand room, and she felt the distance between their two worlds widening with every passing moment. Lady Colette approached her at one point during the evening, studying her with the same appraising curiosity she had shown earlier that day. "You seem to have captured my brother's particular attention," Colette observed, her tone carefully neutral. "May I ask how you came to know him?" Mira hesitated, uncertain how much of the truth to reveal to Edmund's sister. "We met under rather unusual circumstances," she said carefully. "I am not certain it is my place to share the details." Colette studied her a moment longer, an unreadable expression crossing her refined features. "My brother has always been prone to unconventional choices," she said finally. "I hope, for both your sakes, that whatever connection has formed between you proves resilient enough to withstand the pressures that inevitably accompany his position." Before Mira could respond further, Edmund returned to her side, apologizing for his lengthy absence amid the evening's obligations. "Would you care to dance?" he asked, extending his hand toward her with a hopeful expression. Mira glanced around at the elegant guests filling the grand room, acutely aware of how out of place she felt, despite the fine gown Nora had generously provided. "I am not certain I remember the steps well enough," she admitted honestly. "It has been many years since I last attended such an occasion." "Then allow me to guide you," Edmund said gently, his hand still extended patiently toward her. After a moment's hesitation, Mira accepted his hand, allowing him to lead her toward the center of the grand room, as the orchestra began a new, gentle melody. As they moved together through the careful steps of the dance, Mira found herself gradually relaxing, the warmth of Edmund's hand against hers, and the familiar quality of his quiet, attentive gaze, reminding her of the connection they had built together during their weeks by Agnes's fire, despite the vastly different circumstances now surrounding them. "I know tonight must feel strange for you," Edmund said quietly as they danced, surrounded by all of this, "after everything that has passed between us." "It does feel strange," Mira admitted honestly. "I am uncertain how to reconcile the man I came to know in that kitchen, with the Duke addressing this room so confidently only moments ago." "They are the same man, Mira," Edmund said earnestly, his eyes holding hers steadily, despite the crowded room surrounding them. "I promise you that. The title, the responsibilities, the expectations of this room, none of it changes who I truly am, at my core, the same man who shared his bread with you, who found more genuine comfort in your company than in all the wealth and privilege this title affords me." Mira wanted desperately to believe him, yet the events of the evening, the vast gulf between his world and her own, laid bare so starkly before her, left her uncertain whether whatever connection they had built together could truly survive the weight of everything now standing between them. As the dance concluded, a ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd near the entrance of the grand room, and Mira turned to see a tall, well-dressed man striding confidently through the gathered guests, his expression carrying the easy arrogance of someone accustomed to commanding attention wherever he went. She recognized him vaguely from whispered conversations among the townsfolk as Lord Barrow, a nobleman from a neighboring estate known for his ambition and his lengthy pursuit of Lady Colette's favor. "Edmund," Lord Barrow said, approaching with an outstretched hand and a broad smile that did not quite reach his calculating eyes. "How wonderful to finally see you returned among us. The county has sorely missed your presence these past months." "Lord Barrow," Edmund replied, releasing Mira's hand to properly greet the newcomer, though his tone carried a careful reserve that suggested the two men shared no particular warmth between them. "I trust you have been keeping my sister appropriately entertained during my absence." "As best I could manage," Lord Barrow said smoothly, his eyes shifting curiously toward Mira, studying her with an appraising gaze that made her distinctly uncomfortable. "And who might this lovely companion be? I do not believe I have had the pleasure of an introduction." "This is Mira," Edmund said, a note of protective firmness entering his voice. "A guest of mine this evening." Lord Barrow's eyebrows rose slightly at this description, his gaze lingering on Mira a moment longer than politeness strictly required. "A guest," he repeated, his tone carrying an unmistakable note of skeptical curiosity. "Forgive me, but I do not recognize the name among the county's established families. Might I ask where your people hail from, my dear?" Mira felt her cheeks warm under the weight of his pointed question, acutely aware of the implication behind his words, that her presence among such elegant company required some sort of pedigree to justify itself. "My family fell upon difficult circumstances some months ago," she said carefully, refusing to let embarrassment fully claim her composure. "I do not believe my current circumstances are any business of yours, Lord Barrow." A flicker of surprise crossed Lord Barrow's face at her direct response, quickly followed by something colder, more calculating. "How refreshingly candid," he said, though his tone carried little genuine warmth. "Edmund, I must say, your tastes have grown quite unconventional during your time away." "Careful, Barrow," Edmund said, his voice carrying a quiet warning that Mira had not heard from him before, a firmness that reminded her, suddenly and sharply, of the authority he had displayed earlier while addressing the assembled guests. Lord Barrow raised his hands slightly in a gesture of mock surrender, though the calculating gleam in his eyes remained. No offense intended, of course. I simply find myself curious how a woman of such uncertain origins came to capture the attention of our returned Duke so thoroughly. Before the tension between the two men could escalate further, Lady Colette appeared at her brother's side, her expression carrying a diplomatic smoothness clearly practiced through years of managing delicate social situations. "Lord Barrow," she said pleasantly, "I believe the musicians are preparing another set. Would you care to join me for the next dance?" Lord Barrow's attention shifted readily toward Colette, his earlier calculating curiosity replaced by an eager, practiced charm. "It would be my honor, my lady," he said, offering his arm and allowing Colette to lead him away from the tense exchange, casting one final, appraising glance toward Mira before disappearing into the crowd. Once the immediate tension had eased, Edmund turned back to Mira, his expression apologetic. "I am sorry for Lord Barrow's rudeness. He has never possessed the tact I might have hoped for in a man courting my sister's affections." "He is not entirely wrong," Mira said quietly, her earlier confidence faltering slightly beneath the weight of the encounter. "I do not belong among this company, Edmund. My presence here tonight only invites questions and judgments that complicate an already difficult situation." "You belong wherever I choose to bring you," Edmund said firmly, though Mira could see the genuine concern beneath his confident words. "I will not allow the small-minded judgments of men like Barrow to dictate who deserves a place at my side." Despite his reassurances, the encounter had left Mira feeling increasingly uncertain about her place within Edmund's world. The vast gulf between their respective circumstances laid bare so starkly by Lord Barrow's pointed questions. She excused herself shortly afterward, claiming a need for fresh air, and made her way toward a quiet balcony overlooking the manor's expansive gardens, seeking a moment of solitude, away from the overwhelming grandeur of the celebration within. The night air was cool against her flushed skin, and Mira leaned against the stone railing, staring out at the moonlit gardens below, as she tried to steady her racing thoughts. The evening had proven far more complicated than she had anticipated. Every moment of genuine connection with Edmund, immediately followed by a stark reminder of just how vast the distance truly was between his world and her own. She heard soft footsteps approaching from behind, and turned to find Agnes standing there, having apparently slipped away from her kitchen duties briefly, to check on the evening's proceedings. "You seem troubled, child," Agnes said gently, joining her at the railing. "Everything about tonight feels wrong," Mira admitted, grateful for the familiar comfort of Agnes's presence amid the unfamiliar grandeur surrounding her. "I do not belong in that ballroom, Agnes. Lord Barrow made that abundantly clear, and I fear he is not the only one who will hold such opinions." "Perhaps not everyone in that room will accept you easily," Agnes acknowledged, "but I have watched the Duke these past months, both as the ragged man who sat by my fire and as the composed nobleman addressing his guests tonight. I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you, child. That is not something easily dismissed, regardless of what small-minded lords might think." Mira considered Agnes's words carefully, drawing some measure of comfort from her genuine, unbiased perspective. Even if his affection is genuine, Agnes, how could such a connection ever survive the realities of his position? He is expected to marry within his own circle, to maintain alliances and expectations that a woman of my current circumstances could never fulfill. "Expectations can change, child," Agnes said simply. "I have seen enough of life to know that genuine connections, the kind built on true understanding rather than convenience or status, are rare enough that they deserve to be fought for, regardless of the obstacles standing in their way." Before Mira could respond further, she heard the soft sound of the balcony doors opening behind them, and turned to find Edmund approaching, his expression carrying obvious concern. "I noticed you had slipped away," he said, joining them at the railing. "Are you well, Mira?" Agnes offered a small, knowing smile, before quietly excusing herself, leaving Edmund and Mira alone once more beneath the moonlit sky. Edmund studied her carefully, his expression softening with genuine concern. "Lord Barrow's words affected you more deeply than you let on," he observed gently. "They only confirmed what I already suspected," Mira admitted. That whatever connection we shared in Agnes's kitchen exists in an entirely different world than the one you now must inhabit fully. I fear there is no place for me within the world I witnessed tonight." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the moonlit gardens below, before he finally spoke. "I will not pretend the obstacles before us are small, Mira. My position carries expectations I cannot simply ignore, alliances and traditions that complicate any choice I might wish to make freely. But I refuse to believe that the connection we built together, genuine and rare as it has proven to be, should be discarded simply because it does not fit neatly within those expectations." "What are you suggesting then?" Mira asked, searching his face carefully for the sincerity she desperately wanted to believe. "I am suggesting," Edmund said, taking her hand gently in his own, "that I intend to fight for whatever future might exist between us, regardless of the obstacles Lord Barrow or anyone else might place in our path. I only ask that you grant me the chance to prove that intention through my actions, rather than simply my words." Mira felt her heart swell with a cautious hope she had not allowed herself to fully embrace since the previous evening's revelations. Yet even as Edmund's words offered comfort, she remained acutely aware of the significant challenges still standing between them. Challenges that words alone, however sincere, could not fully overcome. The weeks following the grand celebration brought a steady stream of challenges neither Mira nor Edmund had fully anticipated. Word of the Duke's evident interest in a seamstress's assistant of uncertain origins spread quickly through the county's social circles, carried along by servants' whispers and the pointed observations of guests who had witnessed their dance together at the ball. Lord Barrow, in particular, seemed determined to fan the flames of scandal, dropping careful hints among his acquaintances about the impropriety of a duke associating so openly with a woman lacking any recognizable family standing. Mira continued her work at the seamstress's shop, though she found herself increasingly the subject of curious stares and whispered conversations whenever she ventured into town. Nora, ever perceptive, finally coaxed the full story from her one quiet evening, listening with wide-eyed astonishment as Mira recounted the truth of Edmund's identity and the complicated situation now surrounding their acquaintance. "A duke," Nora said, shaking her head in amazement once Mira had finished her account. "And to think, I gave you that gown without knowing the full weight of the occasion you were attending." "I am not certain the gown mattered as much as you might imagine," Mira said wearily. "Lord Barrow made it abundantly clear that no amount of fine fabric could disguise the gulf between my circumstances and those expected of anyone associated with the Duke. Lord Barrow is a bitter man, jealous of attentions he cannot command for himself," Nora said dismissively. "Do not let his opinions weigh too heavily upon your own judgment of the situation." Despite Nora's reassurances, Mira found herself struggling with genuine uncertainty about the wisdom of continuing her connection with Edmund. Though he visited her regularly during this period, arriving quietly at the seamstress's shop in the evenings once his daily obligations had concluded, each visit seemed shadowed by the growing weight of the social pressures mounting against their unconventional bond. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after the grand celebration, Edmund arrived at the shop looking more troubled than Mira had seen him since the night of his revelation in Agnes's kitchen. "What has happened?" Mira asked immediately, sensing the tension evident in his usually composed bearing. "My sister received a proposal today," Edmund said, settling heavily into a chair near the small fireplace in Mira's modest room. "From Lord Barrow himself, seeking her hand in marriage." "That seems a positive development," Mira observed carefully, uncertain why the news seemed to trouble him so deeply. "Does your sister not favor his attentions?" "She does, or believes she does," Edmund said with a tired sigh. "But Barrow has made his acceptance of the match conditional upon certain assurances regarding my own conduct." Mira's stomach tightened with a sinking dread. "What assurances?" "He insists that I end my association with you entirely," Edmund said quietly, claiming that my continued attention toward a woman of uncertain standing brings unwelcome scrutiny upon the family's reputation. Scrutiny he fears might complicate his own standing, should he marry into our household. Mira felt the familiar sting of humiliation rising within her chest, though she forced herself to remain composed despite the painful weight of Edmund's words. "And what have you told him?" "I have told him nothing yet," Edmund admitted. "My sister has pleaded with me to consider his terms, at least until she has secured her own happiness." She fears that my continued defiance of social expectation might cost her the match she has long hoped for. So you find yourself torn, Mira said slowly, between your sister's happiness and whatever connection you believe exists between us. I do not wish to choose between the two, Edmund said, his expression pained. But I confess, Mira, I do not know how to satisfy both obligations without disappointing someone I care for deeply. Mira studied him carefully, a familiar ache settling into her chest, as she recognized, with painful clarity, the impossible position her presence in his life had created. Perhaps the solution is simpler than you believe, Edmund. Perhaps you should honor Lord Barrow's terms, for your sister's sake, and allow our connection to end here, before it causes further complication for those you love. I do not wish for that, Edmund said firmly, rising from his chair to close the distance between them. Mira, I have spent these past weeks fighting to prove that my feelings toward you extend beyond the circumstances of our unusual meeting. I do not intend to abandon that fight simply because Lord Barrow demands it as a condition of his own selfish ambitions. But your sister's happiness hangs in the balance, Mira said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts at composure. How can I allow you to jeopardize that for my sake? You are not jeopardizing anything, Edmund said gently, taking her hands in his own. Lord Barrow's demands reveal far more about his own character than they do about any genuine obstacle standing between us. A man who would hold my sister's happiness hostage to satisfy his own prejudices does not deserve the power to dictate the choices of this family. Mira wanted desperately to believe him, yet the weight of guilt at potentially costing Lady Colette her chance at happiness continued to press heavily upon her conscience. What do you intend to do then? I intend to speak with my sister honestly, Edmund said, and to help her understand that a man who would make such demands is unlikely to bring her genuine happiness, regardless of the match's social advantages. I will not allow Lord Barrow's ultimatum to dictate the course of either of our lives, Mira, not when I believe so firmly in the genuine connection we have built together. Over the following days, Edmund made good on his promise, engaging in lengthy conversations with his sister about the true character of Lord Barrow's demands. Though the conversations proved difficult, Lady Colette gradually came to recognize the troubling implications of a suitor willing to use her own happiness as leverage against her brother's personal choices. Ultimately, she made the difficult decision to decline Lord Barrow's proposal, choosing instead to wait for a match built on genuine mutual respect, rather than one shadowed by manipulation and unreasonable demands. The resolution brought a measure of relief to the tension that had settled over the household, though Mira remained acutely aware that Lord Barrow's departure from the situation did little to address the broader social challenges still standing between herself and Edmund. The county's gossip continued unabated, and she found herself increasingly uncertain whether any resolution to their unconventional connection could truly satisfy the expectations of the world Edmund inhabited. It was during this period of uncertainty that Mira received an unexpected visitor at the seamstress's shop. A stern-faced woman she recognized immediately as belonging to the county's oldest and most respected family, one whose approval carried significant weight within the social circles Edmund navigated daily. I have heard a great deal about you, Miss Mira, the woman said, introducing herself as Lady Winslow, a longtime friend of Edmund's late mother. I confess, I was curious to meet the young woman who has captured our Duke's attention so thoroughly since his return. Mira braced herself for further judgment, expecting the same dismissive skepticism she had encountered from Lord Barrow weeks earlier. Instead, Lady Winslow studied her with genuine curiosity, her expression carrying none of the calculating coldness Mira had come to associate with the county's more judgmental circles. I understand your circumstances have been difficult these past months, Lady Winslow continued gently. Edmund's mother, may she rest peacefully, faced her own share of hardship before finding her place within this family. I suspect she would have found much to admire in your evident resilience, had she lived to witness it herself. Mira felt a cautious warmth spreading through her chest at Lady Winslow's unexpected kindness, a stark contrast to the judgment she had grown accustomed to receiving from much of the county's elite society.
Thank you, my lady,
She said sincerely.
Your words mean more to me than you might realize.
I do not offer them lightly, Lady Winslow said. I have known Edmund since his childhood, and I have never witnessed him speak of anyone with the genuine warmth and respect he shows when discussing you. Whatever obstacles society may place before you both, I would encourage you not to abandon a connection built on such evident sincerity." The unexpected encounter left Mira with a renewed sense of hope, a reminder that not everyone within Edmund's world viewed their unconventional connection with the same harsh judgment as Lord Barrow and his circle. Yet even as this hope took root, she remained painfully aware that significant challenges still lay ahead before any lasting resolution to their situation could be achieved. Spring arrived slowly over the following months, bringing with it a gradual thawing not only of the county's frozen fields but also of the social tensions that had once threatened to tear apart the fragile connection between Mira and Edmund. Lady Winslow's public support of their acquaintance carried considerable weight among the county's finer families, and gradually, the whispered scandal surrounding their unconventional bond began to soften into something closer to grudging curiosity, then eventually, cautious acceptance. Edmund had thrown himself fully into his renewed duties as Duke, earning quiet admiration throughout the estate for the wisdom and fairness he brought to decisions affecting the household staff and tenant farmers alike. Agnes often remarked, during Mira's continued visits to the kitchen, that she had never seen the estate run so smoothly, nor its master seem so genuinely content in the fulfillment of his responsibilities. "He carries the title differently now," Agnes observed one afternoon, as Mira helped her prepare a simple meal, a routine she had continued, despite no longer needing the charity that had first brought her to this kitchen months earlier. "There is less weight in his shoulders, less strain in his expression. Whatever peace he found during his time away seems to have followed him back into this life." Mira smiled at the observation, having noticed the same transformation herself during their continued evenings together. Where once Edmund had approached his duties with visible reluctance and hidden exhaustion, he now seemed to have found a genuine balance between the demands of his position and the quieter, more authentic connections he had discovered during his time as a beggar by Agnes's fire. Their relationship, too, had evolved considerably since the tumultuous events surrounding the grand celebration. Edmund had made a point of introducing Mira gradually into the social circles of the county, never rushing the process, but steadily building genuine relationships with those willing to look beyond her uncertain origins, to recognize the character and resilience that had first drawn his own affection so many months earlier. Lady Colette, once cautiously curious about her brother's unconventional attachment, had grown into a genuine friend to Mira over the intervening months, the two women bonding over shared experiences of navigating the complicated expectations placed upon them by their respective circumstances. Colette had since found happiness with a quieter, more genuine suitor, a gentleman farmer from a neighboring estate, whose steady character stood in marked contrast to Lord Barrow's calculating ambition. One warm evening in late spring, Edmund arrived at the seamstress's shop with an expression Mira had not seen from him before, a nervous energy that seemed at odds with his usually composed bearing. "Walk with me," he said simply, extending his hand toward her. Mira accepted, curious about the source of his evident nervousness, and together they made their way through the quiet evening streets toward the manor's expansive gardens, now blooming fully with the colors of the new season. Edmund led her along familiar paths, past the fountain, where they had once shared quiet conversation during earlier visits, until they reached a secluded corner of the garden, where a single bench sat beneath a blossoming tree. "I have thought a great deal about the journey that brought us together," Edmund said, turning to face her fully, as the last light of evening painted the sky in soft shades of gold and violet. "From that first night you knocked upon Agnes's kitchen door, believing me nothing more than a fellow beggar seeking shelter from the cold, to this moment, standing here together, as the people we have both grown to become, through everything we have faced." Mira felt her heart quicken, sensing the significance building in his words, though she remained uncertain exactly where his thoughts were leading. "I have learned many things during my time as a beggar in my own kitchen," Edmund continued, "but nothing more valuable than the understanding that genuine connection, built on honesty and mutual respect rather than title or circumstance, is the rarest and most precious gift life can offer. I found that gift in you, Mira, long before I ever revealed the truth of who I truly was." He knelt slowly before her, and Mira's breath caught as she realized the full weight of what was unfolding in this quiet garden corner. "I do not ask you to become a duchess for the sake of title or status," Edmund said, his voice carrying a sincerity that resonated deeply within her chest. "I ask you to share your life with me, because you are the one person who has ever seen me clearly, who valued my character above my name, who taught me what it means to be loved simply for who I am, rather than what I possess. Mira, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears gathered in Mira's eyes as the weight of his words settled over her. Memories of that first desperate night at the kitchen door, the quiet warmth of shared bread and honest conversation, the painful revelation of his true identity, and the long months of navigating a world determined to judge their connection unworthy, all converging into this single, perfect moment beneath the blossoming tree. "Yes," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, Edmund, I will." Edmund rose immediately, gathering her into his arms with a joy that seemed to erase every trace of the burden he had once carried so heavily upon his shoulders. They remained there together in the quiet garden, as evening deepened into night, the weight of every obstacle they had faced together finally giving way to a simple, unshakable happiness neither had believed themselves capable of finding. News of their engagement spread quickly through the county in the following days, and though a few voices, echoing Lord Barrow's earlier judgments, continued to question the propriety of the match, the overwhelming response among those who had come to genuinely know Mira proved warmly supportive. Lady Winslow declared herself delighted by the news, and Lady Colette, now happily settled in her own engagement, embraced Mira as a true sister with genuine affection. Agnes, upon hearing the news, wept openly with joy, insisting on preparing a special feast to celebrate the announcement, one held not in the manor's grand dining hall, but in the humble kitchen, where the entire remarkable journey had first begun. "To think," Agnes said, raising a simple cup in a toast, as Mira and Edmund sat together by the familiar hearth, where they had first shared bread so many months earlier, that such a grand love story began with nothing more than a hungry girl begging for scraps, unaware that the ragged man beside the fire held the very title the whole county waited so anxiously to see him reclaim. Edmund smiled warmly, taking Mira's hand in his own, as the fire crackled softly beside them. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the most valuable things in life are found not in grand halls or noble titles, but in the simplest, most honest moments shared between two people, willing to see beyond the circumstances that first bring them together." Their wedding, held the following autumn, brought together the entire county in a celebration far grander than the ball that had first revealed Edmund's true identity to Mira. Yet the couple insisted on including a private moment before the main ceremony, gathering only their closest companions, Agnes, Lady Colette, Nora, and Lady Winslow, within the humble kitchen where their connection had first taken root. As Mira stood in her wedding gown beside the familiar hearth, surrounded by those who had supported their unlikely love from its earliest, most uncertain days, she reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her from a place of desperate hunger and uncertain survival to this moment of profound joy and belonging. The title of Duchess, she realized, mattered far less to her than the genuine love and respect she had found in Edmund, a connection built not on wealth or status, but on the simple, honest recognition of two people who had seen each other clearly, long before either fully understood who the other truly was. And in that quiet kitchen, warmed by the same fire that had once offered shelter to a beggar and a hungry girl both seeking nothing more than a moment's comfort, their story stood as a testament to the enduring truth that genuine love recognizes character above circumstance, and that the most unlikely beginnings can sometimes lead to the most lasting and meaningful happiness.